Welcome to the mysterious casebook. Tonight, we enter the world of Miss Marple in the mystery of the burned choir manuscript. A sacred song reduced to ashes, a village cloaked in whispers, but who wished the music silenced forever? Light a candle, get comfortable, and let the mystery begin. It was a fine Sunday morning in St. Mary, Mead. One of those spring days when the sunlight fell softly over the neat hedgerows and the lilac bushes swayed gently in the breeze. The village was at its most picturesque, the church spire rising confidently above tiled roofs and cottage gardens in bloom. On such mornings, all seemed at peace. Yet beneath the calm exterior, St. Mary Mead-like any village was a place where secrets were tucked away as neatly as jam jars in a larder. At the heart of the day's proceedings was the church choir. They had been rehearsing diligently for weeks under the direction of young Mr. Leonard Weatherby, the earnest new choir master who had recently moved into the vicarage's spare rooms. The highlight of the morning service was to be an old and somewhat rare anthem, an arrangement believed to have been written by a minor Victorian composer, long forgotten except in dusty parish records. Reverend Chiswell had spoken warmly of the find, and Mrs. Price Ridley, never one to be outdone in matters of village culture, had declared it quite a coup for St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple, seated primly in her accustomed pew, listened with polite interest as the opening notes drifted down from the choir loft. She had seen choirs enough in her long life to notice immediately when enthusiasm outstripped discipline, and Mr. Weatherby's young singers were certainly more eager than polished. Still, there was a pleasing quality to the music until, quite suddenly, a thin thread of acrid smoke curled through the air. At first it was scarcely noticed. One or two of the congregation sniffed, assuming perhaps that someone had left a hearth smouldering at home. But within moments the smell grew sharper, unmistakably the stinging odor of paper and cloth burning. A commotion spread through the nave. The hymn faltered, then broke off altogether as the choir members themselves became distracted by the haze drifting from the vestry door. Reverend Chiswell hurried down from the chancel steps, his round face flushed with alarm. "Remain calm, everyone, please," he called, though his voice wavered. "It is nothing serious, I'm sure." But calm was hardly the mood. Mrs. Price Ridley clutched her prayer book dramatically to her bosom, declaring she had always said the vestry stove was dangerous. Colonel Melchett's sister, seated stiffly behind Miss Marple, muttered darkly about careless sacristan. The congregation shuffled restlessly, eyes fixed on the smoke seeping more insistently from under the vestry door. Mr. Weatherby and two sturdy choir boys dashed toward it. There was a moment's muffled struggle, a shout, and then the door was flung wide. A gust of smoke billowed forth, causing coughs and gasps. Within, flames licked angrily at a heap of scorched paper and fabric near the small reading desk. Buckets of water, summoned hastily from the churchyard tap, soon reduced the blaze to a hissing mess. The danger passed quickly enough, but the shock lingered. Soot clung to the vestry walls, and charred fragments littered the flagstones. And at the heart of the blackened heap lay the ruined remains of the very manuscript chosen for that morning's performance. Miss Marple, who had neither cried out nor stirred from her seat during the excitement, now adjusted her gloves thoughtfully. Her blue eyes, deceptively mild, observed the scene with quiet penetration. People rushed forward, too many, she noted, all eager to be useful, but in their eagerness perhaps betraying more than they realized. "It is the anthem," Reverend Chiswell exclaimed in distress, holding up a singed scrap of parchment that crumbled between his fingers. "The precious manuscript is destroyed." Mr. Weatherby, pale beneath his youthful enthusiasm, looked stricken. "Two left it safely on the desk," he stammered. "Only a few minutes ago, before the service began. How could it?" "That stove has ever been a menace," Mrs. Price Ridley declared once more, triumphant in her gloom. "I warned you all, and now see what has happened." But Miss Marple, listening, thought the explanation rather too pat. The little stove in the vestry was indeed old and temperamental, but she doubted it could have ignited a stack of music papers so suddenly without help. Her long experience told her that accidents were often convenient disguises for intention. The congregation dispersed soon after, full of talk and speculation. Some muttered that the choir's performance was cursed from the start. Others whispered of spiteful villagers, jealous of Mr. Weatherby's innovations. Miss Marple, leaning on her parasol, paused outside the church to hear them. Human beings, she knew, could rarely resist supplying explanations, however ill-founded. "Such a pity," murmured Mrs. Clement, the vicar's gentle wife, as she passed by. Leonard worked so hard, and the manuscript was said to be quite rare. Why, Reverend Chiswell believed it might even have some historical value. Miss Marple inclined her head sympathetically, but her mind was already at work. A rare manuscript, destroyed under suspicious circumstances, was a curious thing indeed, and in her quiet, unobtrusive manner, she had already marked which faces betrayed anxiety and which betrayed something closer to relief. By the time she reached her cottage garden with its trim borders and the flutter of sparrows among the hollyhocks, Miss Marple had decided upon one fact, whatever explanation was eventually accepted by the village. The fire in the vestry was no accident, and though others might dismiss it as mere misfortune, she had learned long ago that when things were burned, it was often not the object itself that mattered, but what it might have revealed. St. Mary Mead was never quicker to recover its composure than when the subject of gossip was assured. By the afternoon of that same Sunday, the events at the church had spread through the lanes, the cottages, and the gardens with the speed of a summer wasp. It was said that there was smoke enough to choke half the congregation, that the vestry was nearly gutted, and that the whole choir had fainted from the fumes. Truth, as so often in village life, had become embroidered in the telling. At the Blue Boar Inn, Mr. Tom Lacey repeated to anyone who would listen that he had seen flames leaping higher than the rafters. At the grocer's, Mrs. Hart observed gravely that she had smelled paraffin, though no such thing had been near the scene. And Mrs. Price Ridley, enjoying her sudden authority, declared to her circle of acquaintances that she had been the first to notice the danger and to warn Reverend Chiswell. No one disputed her version aloud, contradicting Mrs. Price. Ridley was a tiresome undertaking. Miss Marple, meanwhile, spent her afternoon in her rose garden, trimming the first blooms of summer and listening unobtrusively to snippets of conversation drifting over the hedge from passers-by. Her ears, sharpened by habit, picked out tones and hesitations more telling than the words themselves. She knew quite well that young Mr. Weatherby, the choir master, was now the focus of sympathy, suspicion, or both. Sympathy, because he was so earnest and had worked so hard. Suspicion, because it was his responsibility, after all, to keep the precious manuscript safe. At tea with her neighbor, Mrs. Bantry, the matter was discussed in more detail. Mrs. Bantry, a woman of lively imagination and little patience for half measures, declared that the whole thing was an outrage. "To think," she exclaimed, setting down her cup with a clatter, "that such a treasure could be lost to sheer carelessness. That boy Weatherby may be charming enough, but he is careless. I saw him only last week leave the church door unlocked while he fetched his bicycle. Anyone might have wandered in." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her knitting needles moving with steady rhythm. "Yes, dear, anyone might have wandered in. That is often the way of things. It is rarely the people one watches who do the damage, but those no one notices at all." Mrs. Bantry, who was used to Miss Marple's gentle-sounding pronouncements, gave her a sharp look. "You mean you think it was deliberate? That someone actually set fire to the music?" "I should hardly like to make pronouncements," Miss Marple replied mildly. "But accidents have a certain look about them, and human nature, as one learns, often expresses itself through fire. It can be a very cleansing or concealing thing." Meanwhile, the Reverend Chiswell was having no easy time of it. That evening he called at the vicarage drawing-room where his wife, Mrs. Clement, sat with embroidery in her lap. and sank heavily into a chair. "The bishop will be furious," he groaned. "I had written to him only last week of our discovery. A rare Victorian manuscript, I told him, preserved for posterity, and now it is gone in a puff of smoke. People will say we were careless, and they will be right." Mrs. Clement, who possessed more sense than her husband, said gently, "It was not your carelessness, dear. You placed the manuscript in the vestry, in good faith. Leonard Weatherby was attending to it. It is not your burden to bear alone." Reverend Chiswell sighed. "Poor boy. He looks quite crushed. But there are whispers, Clara, whispers that he might have had a reason for wanting the thing destroyed. People chatter so cruelly." "Then we must not add to the chatter," Mrs. Clement said firmly. But her brow furrowed all the same. The whispers spread indeed. At the post office, Miss Hartley insisted that the manuscript was probably nothing of value and that all this fuss was a storm in a teacup. But her sharp tone and the quickness with which she dismissed it made Miss Marple, passing quietly by, file her name away in her mental ledger. Over protestation was always worth noting. Colonel Melchett, for his part, discussed the matter with Inspector Slack when the latter made his routine visit to the village. Slack, a man of hearty constitution and little imagination, declared that it was nothing but a stove accident. Old stove, dry paper, a bit of draught from the window, that's all it takes. "You ask me, sir, there's no cause for suspicion." Melchett grunted. "Maybe not. But villagers like to talk, and once they start talking, they'll want someone to blame. Best to keep an eye, Slack. We don't want this turning into something bigger." Slack promised faithfully, though privately he thought it was all nonsense. A burned music sheet was hardly the stuff of crime. But Miss Marple, when she heard of his remarks later from her maid, smiled to herself. Police were so practical, so commonsensical. They forgot that the gravest matters often began with the smallest trifles. That evening, the village gathering at the Women's Institute was dominated by the fire. Opinions clashed, tempers rose, and stories grew even wilder. Some said the manuscript had contained a scandalous dedication to a long-forgotten lady of dubious reputation. Others hinted darkly that a villager had reason to keep its contents hidden. The truth that no one had read more than the title page seemed almost too dull to be believed. Miss Marple, sitting quietly at the back, watched the faces more than she listened to the words. She noted how Mr. Weatherby flushed deeply when Mrs. Price Ridley hinted at negligence, and how Mrs. Hartley's hands twitched at her knitting whenever the manuscript's rarity was mentioned. She observed, too, that young Emily Carter, a shy soprano in the choir, looked perpetually anxious, glancing about as though fearing reproach. Yes, there were patterns that were small, human patterns, but they would only reveal themselves in time. On her walk home beneath the moonlit hedges, Miss Marple reflected as she always did. People, she thought, were much like her garden. At first sight everything appeared orderly, proper, in its place, but scratch a little beneath the surface, and weeds, worms, and old roots were always at work. Something in St. Mary Mead had festered long before this morning's fire, and she suspected the burned manuscript was merely its symptom. When she reached her cottage, she paused by the gate to watch the flicker of a lantern farther up the lane. Someone was out late, moving stealthily toward the church. Miss Marple did not call out. Instead, she watched until the lantern's glow disappeared behind the lich gate. A curious thing, she mused. Very curious indeed. And so, while the village settled into uneasy sleep, the embers of more than the vestry fire glowed beneath the surface of St. Mary Mead. The following morning dawned bright and deceptively peaceful in St. Mary Mead. The roses opened with untroubled serenity, the milkman clinked his bottles along the lane, and the village children hurried to school in their neat uniforms. Yet beneath the quiet, every conversation seemed to return inevitably to the fire in the vestry and the loss of the precious choir manuscript. For some, It was a mere curiosity for others, a scandal in the making. Miss Marple, with her customary air of mild preoccupation, sat in her parlour taking tea with Mr. Clement, who had called in the hope of discussing parish matters. In truth, he had come seeking comfort, for he was deeply troubled by the whispers running through the congregation. "My dear Miss Marple," he said, stirring his tea far more vigorously than necessary, "this business has been most distressing. Clara insists that I should not reproach myself, yet I cannot help feeling responsible. The manuscript was entrusted to our care, and now it is lost. And worse than that, there are those who suggest it was no accident." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes, I have heard such remarks. People are quick to find fault. It is part of human nature, I think. But tell me, who had access to the vestry yesterday morning?" "Well, Leonard, of course. He placed the manuscript on the desk. The verger had been in earlier, but only to lay out the surplices. Mrs. Price Ridley bustled about, as she often does, but she was in the nave when the fire began. And then there are the choir members who come and go, especially the boys." "Ah," Miss Marple said softly. "So quite a number of people, then." Churches are rather like railway stations in that regard. One sees who is meant to be there, but one overlooks the stranger who passes through. Mr. Clement blinked at her, not quite grasping the drift of her remark. But Miss Marple, who had already stored the information away, merely smiled and poured him more tea. That same morning, Inspector Slack arrived, summoned more by duty than conviction. He strode into the vicarage, his boots leaving, muddy prints on the polished floor, and announced that he was there to look into matters. Slack was never one to waste words. He had heard the gossip and was determined to put a stop to it by proving the fire accidental. He examined the stove, prodded the charred remains of the manuscript with a stick, and announced loudly that the whole thing was the result of careless handling of matches. "There you are," he declared. "Nothing more to be said. Old stove, dry paper, open flame. It's plain as day." Reverend Chiswell, visibly relieved, accepted this explanation gratefully. But Miss Marple, who had wandered into the vestry under the pretext of examining some hymnals, observed the blackened fragments with a thoughtful frown. Among the ashes, one corner of parchment was less damaged than the rest, the ink faintly legible. She bent down, seemingly to adjust her glove, and noted the curious presence of a smudge on ordinary soot, but something with a faint oily sheen. She said nothing, merely filing it away in her memory. Later, as she left the churchyard, she encountered young Emily Carter, the timid soprano. Emily's eyes were red from crying, and she started guiltily when Miss Marple greeted her. "Oh, Miss Marple," she stammered, "Two was only coming to see if anything had been saved. Mr. Weatherby is so upset, you know. He feels it is all his fault." Miss Marple regarded her kindly. "And do you think it was, my dear?" Emily hesitated, twisting her handkerchief. No, I don't. He was so proud of the music. He said it might bring new recognition to our little choir. Why would he wish it were destroyed?" She looked away quickly, as though fearful she had said too much. "Quite so," Miss Marple murmured. "Very sensible of you to notice." Emily, flustered, hurried off down the lane. Miss Marple watched her go with a thoughtful expression. The girl knew something, whether she realized it or not. The trick was to let it slip out naturally, as truth so often did when one was not pressing too hard. By midday, the village had settled into its customary rhythm of domestic errands and chance meetings. Yet the fire remained the chief topic. At the butcher's, Mrs. Price Ridley repeated for the third time that she had smelled paraffin at the grocer's. Mrs. Hartley declared that she had glimpsed a stranger lurking near the vestry door. Such contradictions were the lifeblood of village gossip. It was at the grocer's that Miss Marple overheard a most curious exchange. Mrs. Hartley, in her sharp, decisive manner, declared, "I know what I saw. A tall man, not one of ours. Dark coat, hat pulled low. He slipped out of the churchyard gate just as the smoke began. Several heads turned in alarm, yet when pressed for details, Mrs. Hartley faltered, claiming she had been too far away to describe him clearly. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. A stranger was always a convenient invention when one wished to direct suspicion elsewhere. In the afternoon, Colonel Melchett called upon Miss Marple, partly because he respected her shrewd mind, and partly because he found the official explanation unsatisfactory. "Slack insists it was an accident," he said, "but I don't like it. There's more to this than meets the eye. You always notice things, Miss Marple. What do you think?" Miss Marple looked demure. "Why, Colonel, I think that human nature is very much the same everywhere. When something is destroyed, it is often because someone feared what it might reveal. But who, and what that remains to be seen?" Melchett frowned. "You believe someone meant to destroy the manuscript?" "I believe," Miss Marple replied gently, "that it is wiser not to dismiss the possibility." Melchett grunted, half amused, half troubled. He had learned long ago not to underestimate the elderly spinster with the knitting needles. She saw things others missed. That evening, Mr. Weatherby himself came to call upon Miss Marple, pale and anxious. "I know they blame me," he burst out, pacing her parlor with restless steps. "I love that song, Miss Marple. I would never have harmed it, but some people in the village, well, are not so pleased with me. They think I am too ambitious, too modern. Perhaps they are glad of this." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "Ambition can be very trying to one's neighbors, my dear, but envy rarely goes so far as to start a fire. Tell me, had you shown the manuscript to anyone? Anyone who might have been especially interested?" Weatherby hesitated. "Only to Mrs. Hartley, the postmistress. She asked about it after choir practice. And to young Emily, of course she was fascinated. But otherwise, no." Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "And did it contain anything unusual?" He shook his head. "Not that I noticed. It was merely music beautiful, yes, but nothing scandalous." Miss Marple made no reply, but she was thinking hard. If it was only music, why should someone wish to burn it? Unless, of course, there was something more, something overlooked by those too eager to dismiss it as a trifle. As Mr. Weatherby took his leave, she rose and glanced out of the window. Once again she saw a light near the church, this time a candle flickering briefly in the vestry window before vanishing. Twice now, in 2 nights, someone had returned to the scene. That, Miss Marple knew, was never the mark of an accident. And so, while Inspector Slack congratulated himself on settling the matter, Miss Marple quietly prepared to follow the faint, elusive threads of human nature that would lead her to the truth. By Tuesday morning, the talk in St. Mary Mead had taken on a sharper edge. What had begun as shock and speculation was hardening into the conviction that someone local must be to blame for the fire in the vestry. Human nature, Miss Marple reflected, was rarely content with mysteries. It longed for culprits, however ill-chosen. The village had, by tacit agreement, produced its first suspect, Mr. Leonard Weatherby. It was only natural, they said. He had been entrusted with the manuscript. He was young, ambitious, and more than a little too eager to impress. Had he not spoken rashly about reviving the choir, about raising St. Mary Mead's cultural standing? Such ambition, whispered Mrs. Price Ridley darkly at the Blue Boar, often went hand in hand with rashness. Some thought he had destroyed the manuscript by accident and now concealed the truth. Others, more imaginative, believed he had burned it deliberately to cover his incompetence. At the vicarage, Mrs. Clement defended him stoutly. Leonard would never do such a thing, she told her husband. I've seen the boy work late into the night, copying notes, arranging parts. He was proud of that music, but even as she spoke, she could not ignore the faintest twinge of doubt. For in the human heart, even innocence could look guilty when the village decided it so. Inspector Slack, summoned again by Colonel Melchett, questioned Weatherby briskly in the vestry. The young man, pale but defiant, repeated his story that he had left the manuscript safely on the desk, stepped out for a moment to fetch a missing hymn book, and returned to find smoke pouring from the room. Slack harumphed and scribbled in his notebook. "Careless, that's what it is," he said, snapping the book shut. "Matches or candles, a bit of draught from the stove, next thing you know, up it goes. You're young, you don't think. That's all there is to it." Weatherby flushed, "But I never lit a candle. I was in the vestry only minutes before. There was no flame." Slack eyed him shrewdly. "That's what you say. Others might say something different." Miss Marple, seated quietly in a corner pew with her knitting, looked up mildly. "So very often, Inspector, what people say differently depends less on the truth and more on what they are willing to believe. I remember a maid once accused of stealing a brooch. Everyone insisted she was guilty because she had been seen dusting near the jewel case. It turned out, of course, that she was the only one not guilty. The lady of the house had mislaid it herself. People so often look at the obvious and forget to ask who benefits." Slack gave her a dismissive smile. "Thank you, Miss Marple. But this is hardly a matter for old tales." Miss Marple inclined her head without protest, but her eyes lingered thoughtfully on the young choir master, whose hands trembled as he clutched his hat. The second figure to fall under suspicion was Mrs. Hartley, the sharp-tongued postmistress. She had been the one to claim she saw a stranger leaving the churchyard. Now, as stories spread, it was whispered that she herself had lingered unusually long near the vestry that morning. Mrs. Price Ridley hinted that Mrs. Hartley had a curious interest in the manuscript, though she could not say why. At the Women's Institute, tongues wagged freely. "Mark my words," declared Mrs. Price Ridley, "that woman knows more than she lets on. Always prying, always listening. I dare say she read something in that manuscript that was better left hidden." Others nodded, eager for a new suspect. A stern spinster like Mrs. Hartley, with her spectacles and pursed lips, seemed a more satisfying culprit than the handsome young choir master. Miss Marple, seated near the window, observed without comment. She recalled how Mrs. Hartley's hands had twitched when the manuscript was mentioned, and how swiftly she had introduced the idea of a stranger. Deflection, Miss Marple knew, was a very human tendency. But whether it was guilt or merely vanity remained to be seen. A third whisper attached itself to timid Emily Carter. The poor girl had been seen crying outside the church and was said to have been dreadfully nervous of late. Some claimed she had been in love with Mr. Weatherby and jealous of his attentions to others. In the fertile soil of gossip, a romantic motive sprang up overnight. "These girls," said Mrs. Price Ridley knowingly, "they will do the wildest things when crossed in love. Why, I recall a housemaid once who put sugar in her master's petrol tank." Miss Marple, who remembered the incident in question, also remembered that the housemaid had been entirely innocent and that it was the master's son who had ruined the motor car. But she merely smiled and let the others talk. Human beings, she thought, were forever weaving dramas from the thinnest threads. Meanwhile, Colonel Melchett grew increasingly impatient. "Slack insists it's an accident," he told Miss Marple in confidence. "But I don't like it. The whole thing smells wrong. The boy Weatherby may be careless, but I cannot see him deliberately burning the music. As for Mrs. Hartley, she's a busybody, but hardly a criminal. And as for that girl, well, nonsense. What do you think?" Miss Marple set down her knitting. "I think, Colonel, that people often show us who they are, not in what they say, but in how they say it. Guilt has a curious way of peeping through the smallest cracks." The Colonel frowned. "You mean one of them is guilty?" Miss Marple's smile was sweet. "I mean only that one should not be too eager to settle on a culprit. Human nature is a many-petaled flower, Colonel, and often the one that looks most likely to wilt is in fact the strongest." That evening, Miss Marple sat alone by her parlor fire, reflecting on the day's events. She recalled Weatherby's flushed protestations, Mrs. Hartley's sharp denial, Emily's tearful anxiety. Each, in their way, carried the shadow of guilt. Yet guilt, Miss Marple reminded herself, could arise from many causes. One might look guilty because one feared discovery of a small deception unrelated to the crime. One might blush from shyness, not dishonesty. The difficulty was discerning which signs mattered. As the clock ticked softly, she heard the distant sound of footsteps on the lane. She rose and peered through the lace curtain. Once again, a lantern moved stealthily near the church. For the third night in succession, someone had returned to the vestry. That, Miss Marple decided, was no coincidence. The fire had not ended the matter, it had only begun it. She reached for her shawl, then thought better of it. A solitary old lady wandering the lanes at midnight was too conspicuous. Instead, she sat back in her chair, her mind quietly alert. Whoever crept about the vestry after dark would reveal themselves soon enough, and Miss Marple, with her infinite patience, was content to wait. The village might have found its suspects, but the truth, she knew, still smoldered unseen, like embers beneath the ashes of the choir manuscript. By Wednesday, the flames that had devoured the choir manuscript were no longer the only embers smoldering in St. Mary Mead. Suspicions, once vague, were now spoken openly in shop queues and over garden hedges. Leonard Weatherby was defended by some and condemned by others. Mrs. Hartley was both dismissed and distrusted. Emily Carter was pitied, yet watched closely. Each name carried the weight of speculation. Yet amid all the noise, Miss Marple listened not to the words, but to the silences in between. She spent the morning attending to her garden, trimming back overeager honeysuckle, while her mind sifted carefully through impressions. It was then that Mr. Clement stopped by with news. His expression was troubled as he leaned across her little gate. "Miss Marple," he began, lowering his voice, "I thought you should know. Colonel Melchett asked Inspector Slack to examine what remains of the manuscript more carefully. They've found something curious." Miss Marple raised her brows politely. "Indeed. And what might that be?" There were scorch marks on the desk where the manuscript was placed, but oddly, the manuscript itself seems to have burned fully. The desk and the other papers nearby were hardly touched. As though he hesitated, as though the fire had been started directly on the music itself. Miss Marple's eyes brightened ever so slightly. Yes, that would be curious, wouldn't it? Fire, like water, has a way of spreading beyond its intended bounds, unless, of course, one is very careful. Mr. Clement gave her a searching look, but Miss Marple only smiled sweetly and offered him a sprig of honeysuckle for his lapel. Later that day, Miss Marple called at the vicarage under the pretext of delivering a jar of quince jelly. Mrs. Clement welcomed her warmly, though her face was lined with concern. "It weighs heavily on Arthur," she confessed, setting down the jar on the sideboard. "He feels this has brought shame on the parish. And Leonard, poor boy, he scarcely eats. He spends hours pacing the churchyard, as though searching for answers in the stones themselves." Miss Marple listened sympathetically, then gently inquired whether she might see the vestry once more. Mrs. Clement, who trusted Miss Marple's quiet wisdom, agreed. Together they crossed to the church, the air cool and shadowed beneath the stone arches. In the vestry, the charred remains still lay in a box on the desk, awaiting disposal. Miss Marple bent over them, her fingers hovering lightly but never touching. Among the fragments, one small piece had escaped the worst of the fire-torn corner of parchment with faded notation. Most would have dismissed it as meaningless, but Miss Marple's sharp eyes saw something odd, faint lettering in the margin, not musical at all, but words. She peered closer. The script was cramped and old-fashioned, half lost to scorch, yet she could just make out, for her eyes only, before the line crumbled into black. Miss Marple straightened slowly, her expression unreadable. She said nothing to Mrs. Clement, merely remarking on the vestry's draught and the perils of old stoves. But her mind was all right. A personal inscription hidden in the margins of a forgotten anthem, that was something quite different from mere music. As they left the vestry, she noticed another detail most would have missed. On the floor near the desk, caught between two flagstones, was a small fragment of wax. Miss Marple paused delicately to adjust her glove and observed its pale sheen. It was not the dark wax of vestry candles, but a softer, scented variety, something used in domestic parlours. She filed this away with quiet satisfaction. That afternoon, Emily Carter called at Miss Marple's cottage with a basket of eggs from her mother's hens. The girl looked nervous, her eyes darting from side to side as though fearful of being seen. "I only wanted to thank you, Miss Marple," she said, her voice trembling. "You were kind to me the other day when everyone was whispering. I couldn't bear it if they thought I had anything to do with the fire." Miss Marple took the basket with a smile. "My dear, people will always whisper. It is their pastime. But it is rarely the quiet ones who have the most to hide." Emily flushed and looked down. "I did see something, though, only I was afraid to tell. I went into the vestry early that morning to fetch my music, and on the desk before the fire there was another sheet with the manuscript. It had writing on it, not music. A letter, I think. I didn't read it, only a few words, but," she broke off, biting her lip. "But," Miss Marple prompted gently, "it looked like someone's name, a lady's name. I can't be sure, it was half covered, but I think it said Margaret." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily in her lap. "That is very helpful, my dear, and very sensible of you to mention it. Sometimes it is the smallest detail that tells us the most." Emily looked both relieved and frightened, as though she had unburdened herself, yet feared what her words might mean. She left quickly, her basket lighter, but her conscience heavier. That evening, Miss Marple sat before her fire, reflecting on the inscription and the mysterious name. If the manuscript contained a hidden dedication or even a letter, it might explain why someone had gone to such lengths to destroy it. Secrets, she knew, had a way of surviving in unlikely places, only to surface when least desired. The next morning brought further excitement. Mr. Weatherby, while tidying the music cupboard, discovered that several choir books were missing. He reported it immediately to Reverend Chiswell, who was aghast. First the anthem, now our hymnals. What on earth is happening to this parish? Word spread swiftly. Some said it was thieves from outside. Others muttered darkly that someone inside the choir was responsible. Miss Marple, hearing the news over her garden gate, thought it entirely logical. Whoever had destroyed the manuscript might also wish to remove other incriminating documents. She walked to the church that afternoon, ostensibly to admire the roses in the churchyard. Pausing by the porch, she overheard Mrs. Hartley speaking sharply to another villager. "I tell you, the manuscript was worthless," Mrs. Hartley declared. "All this fuss about an old scrap of paper, better it's gone. And if the hymnals are missing, well, perhaps someone fancied the leather for binding. People will steal anything these days." The vehemence in her tone struck Miss Marple as curious. Why be so insistent on the worthlessness of something unless one feared others might discover its true value? As dusk fell, Miss Marple lingered by her cottage gate, watching once more. And once more she saw a faint light flickering near the church. But tonight there was something different. A shadowy figure leaving the vestry in haste, clutching what looked like a bundle of papers. The figure slipped into the lane and vanished into the darkness. Miss Marple did not call out. She rarely did. Instead, she stood very still, the cool evening air brushing against her cheek. Now she was certain the fire had been deliberate, the manuscript not merely lost, but destroyed for a purpose. And if one clue had been burned, others remained. The village might busy itself with careless suspicions, but Miss Marple had glimpsed the outline of something larger, a secret hidden in ink and parchment, buried in the past, and now dangerously exposed. And as she turned back to her little parlor, she knew with the certainty of long practice that the truth, though charred, was not gone. It lingered in the fragments, in the silences, and in the very human need to conceal what ought never to have been revealed. Thursday brought with it a heavy, restless air, as though the village itself shared the unease that had settled upon St. Mary Mead. Rain threatened but never fell, clouds gathered but never broke, and in the parlors and drawing-rooms, tempers simmered just as unpredictably. The burned manuscript had ceased to be merely a curiosity. It had become a wedge, driving old suspicions and rivalries to the surface. Miss Marple was not surprised. Crimes, real or supposed, rarely existed in isolation. They pulled at threads, woven long ago, drawing forth matters that had nothing to do with the immediate event and everything to do with human frailty. That morning she heard, from her vantage point at the grocer's, 2 quarrels in succession, one between Mrs. Price Ridley and Mrs. Hartley, the other between young Emily Carter and another soprano. Each quarrel revealed more about the combatants than about the crime itself. The first quarrel began when Mrs. Hartley, entering the shop for a pound of sugar, found herself confronted by Mrs. Price Ridley, who had clearly been waiting. "Well, Mrs. Hartley," she said loudly, "perhaps you can explain why you lingered in the vestry before the fire. Others saw you, you know. What business did you have there?" Mrs. Hartley stiffened, her spectacles flashing. "I had every right to be there. The vestry has no private chamber, and I was delivering a message from the post. Reverend Chiswell himself will vouch for me." "Oh, indeed," Mrs. Price Ridley retorted, her tone dripping with disbelief. "And yet you are the very one who insists the manuscript was worthless. One might almost think you had reason to see it destroyed." The shopkeeper, trying not to smile, busied himself with his scales while customers leaned subtly closer. Mrs. Hartley's face flushed crimson. "You dare accuse me? I have nothing to hide." Miss Marple, at the far end of the counter, observed the trembling of the woman's hands as she gathered her parcels. Anger, yes, but also fear, the kind that made one careless. She tucked that observation neatly away. Later that afternoon, another confrontation reached Miss Marple's ears. Emily Carter, who had been walking home from choir practice, was stopped by Agnes Blake, a fellow chorister known for her sharp tongue. "It's your fault, Emily," Agnes said spitefully, "always hanging about Mr. Weatherby, making eyes at him. Everyone knows you were in the vestry that morning." Emily's eyes widened with shock. "That's not true. I only went in for my music just for a moment. Just long enough to slip a match, wasn't it?" Agnes jeered, and before Emily could reply, she swept away in a flurry of indignation. Miss Marple, who had been trimming her hedge and appeared wholly absorbed in the task, watched the girl hurry past, tears welling in her eyes. Poor child. Gossip could wound far more cruelly than fire. That evening, Miss Marple received a visit from Colonel Melchett. He was in a state of exasperation. "Slack insists it was an accident, as always," he declared, dropping heavily into her armchair. "But the village is tearing itself apart. First Weatherby, now Hartley, now that poor girl. If someone doesn't put a stop to it, there will be no choir left to sing at all." Miss Marple handed him a cup of tea. "Confusion, Colonel, often arises when people sense more than they understand. A secret has been stirred up, you see, and secrets make people uneasy. They lash out at one another, hoping to relieve their own discomfort." Melchett frowned. But what secret? It was just music. "Perhaps not," Miss Marple replied gently. "Perhaps the music concealed something else. One must ask who feared discovery, and who benefits from silence." Melchett looked at her sharply, but she offered no more, merely stirring her tea with a faint, thoughtful smile. Meanwhile, Leonard Weatherby, desperate to clear his name, decided to confront Mrs. Hartley directly. The encounter took place outside the post office the next morning, and half the village seemed to witness it. "Why are you spreading these lies?" he demanded, his voice trembling with indignation. "You know I would never harm that manuscript." Mrs. Hartley drew herself up. "Lies? I merely tell what I saw. You left the vestry door open. Anyone might have slipped in. If blame rests anywhere, it is with your carelessness. You never even cared for the music," Weatherby shot back. "You said it was worthless, and so it was," she retorted sharply. "Old scraps of paper with no use to anyone." Miss Marple, who happened to be posting a letter, noted the vehemence of her denial. It was not the denial of indifference, but of someone with a stake in the matter. People who truly cared nothing rarely protested so loudly. That same evening, Miss Marple paid a quiet call on Mrs. Clement at the vicarage. Over a pot of chamomile tea she listened as the vicar's wife unburdened herself. "Miss Marple, I cannot help but feel something dreadful is hidden in this. Arthur insists it was an accident, but I found him yesterday staring at the ruins of that manuscript with the strangest look, as though he recognized something in it." "Indeed?" Miss Marple asked softly. Mrs. Clement nodded. "He would not speak of it when I pressed him, only muttered that it was better gone." "Do you think he could know more than he admits?" Miss Marple laid a comforting hand on hers. "I think, my dear, that men of conscience sometimes wrestle with knowledge they would rather not possess. If your husband recognized something, it does not mean he caused it, but it may explain why others fear it." Mrs. Clement looked stricken, but Miss Marple's words were gentle, offering reassurance as much as suggestion. Still, she had marked it the Reverend himself might hold a key, however unwillingly. The following day brought another revelation. At choir practice, Mr. Weatherby discovered that one of the hymnals had been returned, left quietly on the desk in the vestry. He opened it, only to find several pages torn out. The discovery spread quickly, and soon whispers filled the church once more. Miss Marple, slipping into the vestry under the guise of admiring the flowers, examined the book. The torn edges were jagged, as though ripped in haste. One fragment remained, however, stuck in the binding, and on it, faint but legible, was a name Margaret. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. So Emily's memory had been correct. The name appeared again, here, preserved by accident. She did not remark on it, merely replaced the hymnal and allowed others to chatter. But in her mind, a picture was slowly forming, line by line, like an embroidery pattern revealed with each stitch. That night, as she sat by her fire, Miss Marple reflected. Secrets, once hinted at, tended to come into the open whether invited or not. Already she could sense the pressure building, like water behind a dam. Sooner or later someone would break, and in breaking, reveal the truth. And indeed, even as she mused, a knock came at her door. It was Emily Carter, pale and trembling. She clutched a folded scrap of paper, her hands shaking. "Miss Marple," she whispered, "we found this in the churchyard. I think someone dropped it. Please, I didn't know who else to tell." Miss Marple took the paper with calm hands and unfolded it. Inside was a fragment of the missing hymnal page, and in the margin, written hastily, were words unmistakable in their import. She must never know. Emily's eyes filled with tears. "What does it mean?" Miss Marple looked at her kindly, though her mind was already racing ahead. "It means, my dear, that secrets are very seldom buried as deeply as people think, and when they come to light, they burn hotter than any fire." Friday morning broke with a chill mist that clung to the hedgerows and blurred the church spire into a ghostly outline. The villagers, though accustomed to such weather, found themselves shivering more from unease than from cold. For it had become clear, even to those most reluctant to admit it, that the burning of the choir manuscript was no accident. The fragment Emily had brought to Miss Marple, the one bearing the words she must never know could not be explained away by careless flames or faulty stoves. Something deliberate, secretive, and dangerous was at work. Miss Marple rose early and walked to the high street with her shopping basket. As she passed the post office, she heard raised voices inside. Mrs. Hartley, sharp as a pin, was in a heated argument with none other than Reverend Chiswell. "You cannot dismiss it, Reverend," she cried. "You know as well as I that there are things better left hidden. I warned you, and now look at what has come of it." The vicar's voice was lower, but trembled with indignation. "Madame, I will not be spoken to in this fashion. The parish is not your plaything. Kindly remember your place." There was the sound of a slammed door, and Mrs. Hartley stormed out, her face blotched crimson. She caught sight of Miss Marple, sniffed sharply, and swept past without a word. Miss Marple watched her go, her mild eyes thoughtful. The Reverend, too, emerged moments later, looking shaken. He paused, saw Miss Marple, and managed a wan smile. "Good morning, Miss Marple. These are trying times." "Yes," Miss Marple replied softly. "Trying indeed. Secrets have a way of disturbing more than those who keep them." The Reverend gave her a startled glance, as though she had touched on something he wished to forget, then hurried away down the lane. By midday, the village was in uproar once more. Word spread quickly that another incident had occurred, this time in the church itself. When Miss Marple arrived, leaning on her parasol, she found a small crowd gathered by the porch. Inspector Slack was already inside, grumbling loudly. On the floor of the vestry, beside the very desk where the manuscript had burned, lay the body of old Mr. Pritchard, the verger. His head was bent at an unnatural angle, and beside him lay the overturned oil lamp he had been using. Slack announced brusquely that the man had suffered a fall. "Clumsy, that's all it is," he declared. "These old fellows, pottering about in the dark, one misstep and down they go." But Miss Marple, looking closely, noticed something peculiar. Mr. Pritchard's spectacles were missing. They were usually perched firmly on his nose, yet they were nowhere near him. Nor were they broken on the floor, as one would expect from a fall. She said nothing aloud, but filed the details away with the others. Mrs. Price Ridley was already holding court outside. "Mark my words," she declared to an eager audience. "The poor man knew something. He was always fussing about the vestry, poking into cupboards. Perhaps he saw too much, and now, well, there you are." Silenced. The word hung in the air, scandalous and delicious. The crowd murmured, torn between horror and fascination. Emily Carter, pale as paper, clung to the church gate. "It isn't true," she whispered. He was kind, and he would never meddle. But her trembling voice carried little weight against the tide of speculation. Colonel Melchett arrived soon after and drew Miss Marple aside. "I don't like this, not one bit," he muttered. "First the manuscript, now Pritchard. Slack insists it was an accident, but I've seen enough in my time to know better. What do you make of it?" Miss Marple's expression was grave. "I think, Colonel, that once one falsehood is set alight, it is very difficult to contain the flames. They spread to places one never intended. Poor Mr. Pritchard may indeed have known something small, perhaps, but dangerous to the one who feared discovery." Melchett swore under his breath. "Then we must find out what it was, before anyone else comes to harm." That evening, the vicarage was heavy with gloom. Mrs. Clement wept softly at the loss of the kindly verger, while her husband sat in stony silence. At length he spoke, his voice strained. "It is God's will. The man was old. His time had come." Miss Marple, who had been invited to share tea, regarded him steadily. "Yes, Reverend, we are all in God's hands. Yet sometimes men hasten what ought to come in its own time." The Reverend's spoon rattled in his saucer, and he did not meet her eyes. Mrs. Clement, noticing, reached to comfort him. "Arthur, dearest, you look so unwell. Perhaps you should rest." Later, walking home beneath the dim glow of the lanterns, Miss Marple reflected. Pritchard's death changed everything. The destruction of the manuscript might have been explained away as vandalism or spite, but death was different. It could not be dismissed as easily. It forced people to consider the lengths to which someone would go to keep a secret buried. When she reached her garden gate, she paused. On the path at her feet lay a small object glinting faintly in the moonlight. She stooped and picked it up. It was a pair of spectacles, Pritchard's spectacles. The lenses were intact, the frame unbroken. Miss Marple stood very still, the cool night air pressing around her. If the glasses had been removed before his fall, then his death was no accident. Someone had been with him in the vestry, and that someone had taken the trouble to carry away the evidence, only to drop it carelessly in the lane. She turned the glasses over in her hand, and thought of the words on the burnt fragment. She must never know. A name in the margin, Margaret. A confrontation in the post office, the Reverend's uneasy silence, Mrs. Hartley's sharp denials. Pieces of a puzzle, scattered like charred fragments, waiting for the hand that could arrange them, and Miss Marple, in her quiet, unassuming way, was already fitting them into place. The village of St. Mary Mead would soon learn that secrets, once ignited, could never be safely contained. The discovery of Mr. Pritchard's spectacles spread through St. Mary Mead with the same velocity as every other morsel of news. By Saturday morning, the village was alive with whispers that his death had been no accident after all. Though Inspector Slack continued to insist that the verger had merely stumbled, few were inclined to believe him now. The word murder was being whispered furtively, with relish over garden fences and across the counter at the Blue Boar. Miss Marple, seated with her embroidery at her sitting-room window, observed the unease settling upon her neighbors. People walked more quickly, glanced over their shoulders, and gathered in little knots of conversation. Fear had entered the village, and fear, she knew, could be just as dangerous as guilt. That morning Colonel Melchett called, looking harassed. "Slack refuses to see it," he said bluntly, pacing Miss Marple's parlor. "He insists the man tripped, that the lamp was an unfortunate accident. But the spectacles you found, Miss Marple, how do you account for that?" Miss Marple set her needlework aside. "Accidents are very clumsy things, Colonel. They rarely tidy up after themselves. The absence of the spectacles speaks of a hand that removed them, and a hand that removes evidence is very seldom innocent." Melchett sighed. "Exactly. But proving it is difficult. Unless someone saw something, we've nothing but conjecture." Miss Marple poured him tea with her usual calm. "You will forgive me if I suggest, Colonel, that human nature often betrays itself in the smallest ways. People say too much, or too little. They reveal themselves not in what they intend, but in what they cannot help." Melchett gave her a sharp look. "You mean you already suspect someone?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I merely observe, Colonel. And I have noticed that those most insistent on dismissing the matter are often those most deeply entangled in it." Meanwhile, suspicion continued to fall heavily on Leonard Weatherby. His earnest denials and youthful agitation seemed to many the very picture of guilt. At the Blue Boar, Mr. Lacey declared he would never trust a young man with bookish airs. Mrs. Price Ridley was certain that Weatherby's ambitions had led him astray, and she was not above suggesting that Emily Carter's tearful visits to him hinted at a scandalous attachment. Emily, poor girl, was indeed distraught. Miss Marple encountered her on the lane, her eyes red from weeping. "They all say Leonard did it," she whispered, "but I know he didn't. He couldn't. He loved the music too much. He only wanted the choir to shine." Miss Marple regarded her kindly. "And yet, my dear, love of music does not prevent one from fearing discovery. Tell me, did Mr. Weatherby ever confide in you about the manuscript?" Emily hesitated. "Only that it was unusual. He said there were notes in the margin, words he didn't understand. He didn't want to alarm anyone, so he told me to keep it quiet. I promised, but then it was burned." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Secrets are very burdensome things, Emily. They weigh upon the heart until they burst out, often in the most destructive ways." Later that day, Miss Marple made her way to the post office. She found Mrs. Hartley sorting letters with her usual briskness, her mouth set in a tight line. Miss Marple offered a cheerful remark about the weather, which was received with a curt nod. Then, in her mildest voice, she said, "Such a pity about poor Mr. Pritchard. One wonders what he might have seen before his fall." Mrs. Hartley froze for the briefest instant before replying. He saw nothing. Old men always stumble. It is the way of things. Miss Marple smiled gently. "Yes, one often assumes so. And yet, I once knew a case where an old gardener stumbled into rather more than was intended for him. It proved most unfortunate for the person who believed him blind." Mrs. Hartley's hands faltered on the envelopes. "I really must attend to my work," she said sharply. Miss Marple left with her stamps and a faint smile. It was not a confession, but it was close enough to reveal that Mrs. Hartley knew more than she admitted. That evening, the vicarage was once again the scene of unease. Reverend Chisel dined in silence, his fork scarcely lifted. At last, in the privacy of his study, he confided to his wife. "Clara, the manuscript should never have been brought to light. It contained private words that were better forgotten. I thought they were harmless at first, but now," he broke off, his face pale. Mrs. Clement, alarmed, urged him to explain, but he shook his head. "No, my dear. To speak of it now would do more harm than good." Unbeknown to him, Miss Marple had been invited for a post-supper sherry and, seated quietly by the fire, had heard enough through the thin door to add another thread to her tapestry. So the Reverend had recognized something, perhaps the name Margaret, perhaps more, and his silence was not ignorance, but dread. The next morning brought yet another twist. The missing hymnals, thought gone for good, were discovered dumped in the churchyard well. They were sodden, ruined beyond repair. A group of boys, peering into the well for mischief, had spotted the floating leather covers. Reverend Chiswell was horrified, and Inspector Slack declared it an act of village hooliganism. Miss Marple, however, noted that the hymnals were not all accounted for. One, she was certain, remained missing, and it was often the one piece not found that mattered most. By now, the tension in the village had reached breaking point. People avoided each other's eyes at service, whispered in corners, and speculated endlessly. Some said the manuscript had contained a love letter between the composer and a lady of high position. Others claimed it hid a confession of long-forgotten crime. Each theory grew wilder, and yet each carried a kernel of truth. There was something in those margins that someone was desperate to erase. Miss Marple sat that evening in her parlor, her knitting resting idle in her lap. She thought of Emily's frightened face, of Mrs. Hartley's sharp denial, of the Reverend's haunted words, and she thought too of poor Pritchard, silenced forever. At length she rose, set aside her needles, and gazed out of the window at the shadowed spire of the church. There was one more piece yet to fall into place. Someone had gone to great length, first by fire, then by theft, and finally by silencing a witness. And Miss Marple, with her quiet patience, intended to coax the truth into the open. The shadows gathering in St. Mary Mead were dark indeed, but she knew from long experience that even in the deepest shadow, the smallest light could reveal everything. Sunday morning arrived once more in St. Mary Mead, though the usual peace of the Sabbath was nowhere to be found. The bell tolled as it always did, summoning the faithful, but the congregation filed in with hushed voices and anxious glances. Where once there had been gossip, Now there was fear. The fire, the missing hymnals, the death of old Pritchardike had unsettled the village until the very air seemed thick with unease. Miss Marple, seated primarily in her accustomed pew, allowed her keen eyes to wander over the flock. She noted how Leonard Weatherby kept his gaze fixed on his hymn book, though his hands trembled visibly. She observed Mrs. Hartley's lips pressed thin, as though she held back words that threatened to burst forth. Emily Carter's eyes were red, and she glanced continually toward the choir loft, her distress plain. And at the front, Reverend Chishol's face was pallid, his voice quavering as he read the lessons. Each person carried a weight, though the nature of that weight was not the same. After the service, the village clustered in uneasy knots. Some whispered that Pritchard's death was divine judgment. Others hinted darkly that the devil walked in their midst. Miss Marple lingered near the lich gate, her parasol resting lightly in her hand, and let the fragments of conversation wash over her. People betrayed themselves, not in their declarations, but in their slips and silences. It was a habit she had cultivated to excellent effect over the years. Colonel Melchett approached, his brow furrowed. "It cannot go on, Miss Marple. Slack insists there is no case, but the village is half mad with speculation. If there is anything at all you can tell me." Miss Marple smiled gently. "It is too soon for conclusions, Colonel. But I think we may soon see the truth if we watch closely. You see, those who conceal secrets grow careless when the pressure mounts, and in St. Mary Mead the pressure is mounting indeed." That afternoon, an extraordinary meeting of the parish council was held at the vicarage. Ostensibly, it was to discuss the loss of the hymnals and the damage to the church, but in truth, it became a stage for confrontation. Miss Marple, invited as a respected elder of the parish, took a quiet seat near the window and prepared to listen. Leonard Weatherby was the first to speak, his youthful face flushed. "I will not sit by while my name is dragged through the mud. I love that manuscript. I worked tirelessly for this choir, and yet I am treated as though I had set the fire myself. It is unjust." Mrs. Hartley sniffed. "Young men are often careless, whether they mean harm or not. I saw you leaving the vestry that morning, Mr. Weatherby. Who is to say what you left behind?" "That is a lie," Weatherby burst out. "I left nothing burning. If anything, it is you who seem over-anxious to call it worthless. Why? What did you see in those margins that so frightened you?" A gasp rippled through the room. Mrs. Hartley's face went crimson. "How dare you? I saw nothing of the sort." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly in her lap. The vehemence of Mrs. Hartley's denial was telling. To deny too strongly was often to admit more than one intended. Emily Carter, trembling, rose to her feet. "Please, please stop quarreling. The manuscript is gone and Mr. Pritchard is dead. Must we tear each other apart as well? If there was something in the writing, then let us say so openly." Her words fell into a sudden silence. The Reverend Chiswell shifted uneasily in his chair. "My dear, these are not matters for public discussion. The parish must preserve its dignity." But Emily pressed on, her voice shaking. "I saw it, Reverend. A name. Margaret. Written in the margin. Why should that be burned unless it meant something?" Reverend Chiswell's face was drained of color. He half rose, then sank back, clutching the arms of his chair. "You are mistaken. You saw nothing." His denial was soft, almost pleading. Miss Marple observed the room keenly. Weatherby's anger, Hartley's sharpness, Emily's courage, and the Reverend's fear all told their own story. Yet the full picture was not yet complete. The meeting ended in disarray. No decision was made, no harmony restored. The villagers left more divided than before, some glaring, others whispering. Miss Marple lingered until the room was nearly empty. She had seen enough to know that the time was approaching when the truth would surface. But before then, there must be one more test of a small prod to bring the hidden motives into the open. That evening, she contrived to meet Emily Carter on the lane. The girl, still shaken from the council, clutched her shawl tightly about her shoulders. "I should not have spoken," she murmured. "Everyone looked at me as though I had said something dreadful." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "On the contrary, my dear, you spoke very bravely. Sometimes a single word. Margaret, for instance, can open doors that have long been shut. But courage often makes enemies, and you must take care." Emily shivered. "You mean someone might wish me harm?" Miss Marple's gaze was steady. "Those who fear discovery may act rashly. But remember, Emily, those who threaten are often the weakest. It is the calm ones you must watch." Meanwhile, Colonel Melchett paid another call on Inspector Slack. Their exchange was heated. Slack, red-faced, insisted once more that the matter was closed. The verger tripped. The manuscript burned by accident. End of story. "End of nothing," Melchett snapped. "This village will not settle until the truth is clear, and if you will not pursue it, others will." Miss Marple, hearing later of this quarrel, allowed herself a small sigh. The police were so often impatient either to dismiss or to act too boldly. The delicate work, she knew, was in the middle ground, in watching until people betrayed themselves. That night, the village lay uneasy beneath the moonlight. Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting untouched, and thought carefully. The fire had been deliberate, the hymnals destroyed, the verger silenced. The inscription. She must never know, and the name Margaret pointed towards something long hidden, something shameful enough to drive one to desperate measures. And now the guilty party, pressed by suspicion, was drawing nearer to exposure. Miss Marple folded her hands and gazed out into the quiet lane. Soon, she knew, the time would come for her to set the final test, subtle, gentle, and deadly in its precision. Human nature would do the rest. For those who had tried to silence the truth would, in the end, reveal themselves by the very means they had used to conceal it. Monday dawned grey and oppressive, the clouds hanging low over St. Mary Mead as though they too bore the weight of unspoken secrets. The villagers moved about their errands with anxious energy, eager to speak yet wary of saying too much. By now, the fire in the vestry and the death of poor Pritchard had become more than misfortune. They were symbols of something darker, something festering beneath the calm surface of village life. And Miss Marple, ever attentive to the small signs, knew the moment had come to draw the truth out. She began quietly, as was her way. That morning she visited Mrs. Hartley at the post office with a simple request for stamps. The postmistress, brusque as always, handed them over, but Miss Marple's mild remark lingered. "It is curious, is it not, how words scribbled in a margin can cause more trouble than all the music in the world?" Mrs. Hartley's hand jerked, dropping a bundle of envelopes. "I don't know what you mean," she snapped. "Idle gossip, that's all. People see what they want to see." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied sweetly. "I remember a case where a laundress swore she had seen nothing written on a handkerchief. Yet later, when the truth came out, it was precisely her denial that gave her away. Such a pity she was not more careful." She left without waiting for an answer, though she felt Mrs. Hartley's eyes burning into her back. Next, she sought out Leonard Weatherby. She found him pacing the choir loft, his face pale, his hands restless. "Miss Marple," he burst out the moment he saw her, "you believe me, don't you?" "You must. They're all against me, but I had nothing to do with the fire or with Pritchard's death." Miss Marple regarded him kindly. "I believe, Mr. Weatherby, that your love of music is quite genuine, but love does not shield one from suspicion. Tell me, if the manuscript contained wordswords that might have caused pain, would you have destroyed it to protect someone?" Weatherby shook his head violently. "Never. I only wanted the choir to succeed. But I did notice there were words. A name, perhaps. I didn't understand them, and I swear I told no one but Emily. If anyone else knew, he broke off, stricken. Miss Marple patted his arm. You must not despair. Truth has a way of making itself heard, even above the loudest gossip. Her third visit was to Emily Carter. The girl, still pale, opened her door timidly. I was so frightened after the council meeting, she confessed. Everyone looked at me as though I had betrayed something dreadful. I only wanted to help. And you did, my dear, Miss Marple assured her. But courage often brings consequences. Tell me, did you notice anyone else in the church that morning before the fire? Emily frowned, thinking hard. Only Mrs. Hartley, I think. She came in while I was leaving. She looked at the desk very quickly, then hurried away. I thought nothing of it at the time. Miss Marple nodded, satisfied. Pieces were aligning, though the picture was not yet complete. That evening, Miss Marple invited a small group to her cottage for tea. Mrs. Hartley, Leonard, Weatherby, Emily Carter, Colonel Melchett, and, most reluctantly, Reverend Chiswell. The gathering was presented as a chance to clear the air, but in truth it was the stage for her quiet test. Her parlour was warm, the fire glowing in the grate, the table laid with scones and seed cake. Miss Marple poured tea with her usual serenity, speaking of gardens and the weather until the tension eased. Then, with apparent casualness, she said, "It is remarkable how fragments survive even the fiercest flame. One corner of the manuscript, you know, was not entirely consumed. It bore words of a most private nature." Silence fell. Weatherby leaned forward eagerly. Emily clasped her hands. Reverend Chiswell paled. Mrs. Hartley's spoon rattled against her saucer. For her eyes only, Miss Marple continued softly. And then, of course, the name Margaret. Reverend Chiswell closed his eyes briefly, as though in prayer. Weatherby gave a cry of astonishment. Emily gasped. Mrs. Hartley alone spoke, her voice sharp. Nonsense, fabrications to stir trouble. No such words existed. Miss Marple looked at her mildly. Ah, my dear, but how curious that you are so certain of their absence, when only a handful of people even knew the manuscript contained writing at all. The effect was immediate. Weatherby stared at Mrs. Hartley in shock. Emily covered her mouth. Colonel Melchett's eyes narrowed. Mrs. Hartley flushed, her hands trembling, but she said no more. Miss Marple let the silence linger before turning to the Reverend. Perhaps you can enlighten us, Mr. Chiswell. You seemed, the other evening, quite distressed at the manuscript's loss. Was it because you recognized the writing? The Reverend's lips moved soundlessly before words came. Yes, he whispered at last. It was a dedication. From long ago. Written by a man of the parish, a man who loved a woman he could never claim. It bore her name. My mother's name. Gasps echoed around the room. Miss Marple's eyes were gentle. Then you understand why someone might have wished to destroy it. But the manner, the secrecy, the fire, the silencing of poor Pritchard, those go beyond mere embarrassment. Colonel Melchett leaned forward. Do you mean to say, Reverend, that this was all about some old romantic scandal? But Miss Marple raised her hand. Not scandal, Colonel Fear. The fear that a secret, once revealed, would cast its shadow upon the present. And fear, as I have often observed, makes people rash. Her eyes moved slowly to Mrs. Hartley, who sat rigid, her face white. And sometimes, Miss Marple continued softly, fear makes them dangerous. Mrs. Hartley shot to her feet. You cannot accuse me. I did nothing, nothing. She snatched her handbag and fled the room, the door banging behind her. A stunned silence followed. Emily clung to her teacup, her knuckles white. Weatherby looked bewildered. Reverend Chiswell buried his face in his hands. Colonel Melchett muttered an oath under his breath. Miss Marple, unruffled, resumed her knitting. We must be patient, she said calmly. The truth, like a seed, has a way of sprouting when least expected, and now I think we shall see it push through the soil very soon." Her guests departed shortly after, leaving Miss Marple alone with her thoughts. She gazed into the fire, her needles moving steadily, and reflected. The final test had been set. Already the cracks were showing, and soon, very soon, the whole facade would crumble. Outside, the village lay quiet beneath the darkening sky. But in the hearts of its people, shadows deepened and secrets trembled on the brink of exposure. The following evening, Colonel Melchett arranged for a discreet meeting in the vicarage library. Though the village seethed with rumors after Mrs. Hartley's dramatic flight from Miss Marple's cottage, Melchett was determined to bring the matter to a close. "We cannot go on like this," he muttered to Inspector Slack, who scowled but obeyed. "The whole parish is in uproar. If there is a truth to be had, it must be had now." Miss Marple was invited, of course, and arrived punctually, her knitting bag tucked primly under her arm. She was the picture of modest serenity, though her blue eyes were keen. Gathered in the room were the principal figures: Leonard Weatherby, pale but defiant Emily Carter, trembling Reverend Chiswell and his wife, anxious and subdued, and finally Mrs. Hartley, who had been persuaded none too gently by Colonel Melchett to attend. She sat stiff and silent, her handbag clutched like a shield. The fire crackled in the grate, casting flickering light upon faces tense with expectation. Colonel Melchett cleared his throat. "We are here to settle this matter once and for all. Too many lives have been darkened already. Miss Marple, you have asked for this gathering. The floor is yours." Miss Marple inclined her head, her voice soft and measured. "Thank you, Colonel. It is never pleasant to speak of wrongdoing, especially among neighbors and friends. Yet truth, once sought, must be spoken, or else more harm follows." She set her knitting gently aside and folded her hands. The fire in the vestry, the destruction of the manuscript, the disappearance and ruin of the hymnals, and the tragic death of Mr. Pritchard, these were not disconnected events. They form a pattern shaped by fear of something written in the margin of that music. Leonard Weatherby stirred. The words. For her eyes only Margaret. I saw them, just faintly. "Yes," Miss Marple said. And Emily, too, glimpsed the name, a name that held significance, though few now remembered it. For Margaret was once a young woman of this parish, and the composer of the anthem, long forgotten by history, was a man hopelessly devoted to her. The dedication was harmless enough, but over the years it was twisted into something else, a symbol of a past relationship that might cast shadows even today. Her gaze moved gently to Reverend Chiswell, who flushed and bowed his head. "You recognized it, did you not, Reverend? You knew your mother's name when you saw it." The vicar's voice was heavy with shame. Yes, it was hers. She was young, and a musician admired her. Nothing improper, but gossip in those days was vicious, and had it been revived now, it might have stained her memory and my ministry. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "Quite understandable, Reverend. Yet you did not set the fire. You're too honest, too burdened by conscience." "No, someone else feared that inscription, not for your sake, but for their own." Her eyes turned slowly to Mrs. Hartley. The room grew still. The postmistress stiffened, her lips tightening. "This is absurd," she snapped. "What possible concern could it be of mine?" "Because, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, "you are Margaret's daughter." Gasps filled the room. Mrs. Hartley's face went white, then blotched red. How dare you?" "It was not common knowledge," Miss Marple continued softly. "Your mother's first marriage ended quietly, before she married again. You've always been sensitive about it, have you not? You feared that if the dedication became known, it would cast questions on your parentage, your respectability. And so, when you saw the manuscript, you panicked. You tried to dismiss it as worthless. You suggested a stranger had been in the churchyard, to deflect suspicion. But when Mr. Pritchard discovered the same name, you silenced him." Emily gave a little cry. Leonard Weatherby stared in horror. Colonel Melchett's eyes hardened. "Is this true, Mrs. Hartley?" Mrs. Hartley clutched her handbag with white knuckles. "I only wanted to protect my mother's name. She was a good woman. She did nothing wrong. I could not bear the whispers, the speculation. You all know what this village is like." Miss Marple's voice was kind, but firm. "We do indeed, my dear. But destroying the manuscript, drowning the hymnals, and causing the death of a harmless old man, those are not acts of protection. They are acts of fear, carried too far." Inspector Slack, his face flushed, rose abruptly. "So it was you all along, Mrs. Hartley. You'll answer this." Mrs. Hartley sank back in her chair, her eyes darting wildly. "I never meant to kill him." "Pritchard surprised me. He said he'd tell the Reverend what he'd seen. I tried to stop him, to reason with him. He struggled, and the lamp fell." Her voice broke. "I never meant—" A heavy silence followed her words. Mrs. Clement wept softly into her handkerchief. Reverend Chiswell bowed his head, his shoulders shaking. Leonard Weatherby looked stricken, though perhaps relieved to be free of suspicion. Emily clung to the arm of her chair, her face pale but resolute. Colonel Melchett broke the silence at last. "Mrs. Hartley, you will come with us. Slack, see to it." As the inspector stepped forward, Mrs. Hartley rose stiffly, her dignity crumbling. "You will never understand," she muttered bitterly. "You have never known what it is to live under a shadow." Miss Marple looked at her with quiet compassion. "We all live under shadows, my dear, but it is how we bear them that matters." When Mrs. Hartley was led away, the others remained, shaken and subdued. Miss Marple picked up her knitting once more, her needles clicking softly. "It is always the same," she said gently. "The smallest things, the margin of a page, a forgotten name can stir the deepest fears. And fear, once kindled, can burn hotter than any fire." Reverend Chiswell murmured, "You have spared us worse scandal, Miss Marple. I do not know how to thank you." She shook her head. "No thanks are needed. I've only observed what was there to be seen. It is always there, you know human nature. One has only to look." The fire in the grate burned low. Outside, the bells tolled softly in the dusk, and within the vicarage library, St. Mary Mead's darkest secret had finally come to light. The days that followed Mrs. Hartley's arrest passed slowly, like the gradual clearing of a storm. The village of St. Mary Mead, which had been a cauldron of whispers and suspicions, began at last to settle. Yet the air was still heavy with unease, for though the truth had been revealed, it had left behind the bitter taste of sorrow. The Blue Boar, once alive with speculation, now offered only subdued conversation. Mr. Lacey no longer held forth with certainty about Weatherby's guilt. Instead, he shook his head gravely and said, "Never would have thought it, never." Mrs. Price Ridley, though secretly gratified that her predictions of wrongdoing had proved correct, maintained a somber dignity, remarking only that she had always believed Mrs. Hartley to be a woman of too much pride. And at the post office, the blinds were drawn, the counter left in the hands of a young assistant drafted in from the next parish. Customers spoke in whispers, glancing at the closed door with a mixture of pity and condemnation. Leonard Weatherby was perhaps the most visibly changed. Relieved of suspicion, he threw himself into his duties with renewed vigor, determined to restore the choir to some semblance of unity. Yet his youthful face was shadowed, his enthusiasm tempered by the memory of how quickly trust had crumbled around him. He thanked Miss Marple earnestly one afternoon, catching her in the churchyard. "You saved me," he said simply. "I don't know how you saw it when no one else did." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling. "One sees a good many things if one has lived long enough, my dear. People are very much alike, you know. Their troubles and fears take different shapes, but the patterns are always there. Emily Carter, too, was changed. She carried herself with more gravity, though her eyes still bore traces of recent tears. She had found courage in speaking out, but also sorrow in the knowledge of what her words had helped uncover. She told Miss Marple softly, "I did not want to hurt her. I only thought the truth should be known." "Truth is rarely kind, Emily," Miss Marple replied gently, "but it is always necessary." Mrs. Hartley was not wicked at heart, only afraid. Fear is the cruelest master of all. Reverend Chiswell, meanwhile, struggled beneath the weight of his family's past. The revelation that his late mother's name had been linked to a forgotten romance had shaken him deeply. For a time he withdrew into his study, speaking little, his sermons faltering. But with the steady support of Mrs. Clement, he began slowly to recover. One Sunday he stood before his congregation with a new humility, preaching not of judgment but of forgiveness. It was said afterward that his words carried more power than any he had spoken before. Colonel Melchett and Inspector Slack concluded the matter briskly, though each in his own fashion. Melchett was grave, acknowledging the complexity of the case and praising Miss Marple's unerring insight. Slack, on the other hand, grumbled that it was all a fuss about an old piece of paper and privately wished that Miss Marple would keep her observations to herself. Yet even he could not deny that her quiet deductions had pierced where his practical eyes had failed. And so the village life resumed. The shops opened as before, the children ran laughing along the lanes, and the choir began rehearsals anew. Yet there was a difference and undercurrent of caution, a reminder that even in the most peaceful of parishes, shadows could lurk just beneath the surface. People spoke more softly of one another, less eager to condemn too quickly, though whether this lesson would endure was another matter. As for Miss Marple, she returned to her cottage and her garden, her knitting, and her endless quiet observations. One afternoon, Mrs. Bantry came to call, full of questions and exclamations. "My dear Jane, how on earth did you know it was Mrs. Hartley? I should never have guessed. She was so respectable, so ordinary." Miss Marple chuckled softly. "My dear Dolly, people are never so ordinary as they seem. Respectability is often the neatest disguise. One learns to watch, not what people say, but what they avoid saying. And Mrs. Hartley avoided too much. She dismissed the manuscript, denied the writing, and spoke of strangers. All very convenient." Mrs. Bantry shook her head in admiration. "I declare, Jane, you would have made a splendid detective." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Oh no, my dear. I should never have the patience for rules and officialdom. But one does pick up a great deal, living quietly in a village. People reveal themselves constantly, if one only takes the trouble to notice." When Mrs. Bantry had gone, Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting in her lap, and gazed out at the evening light softening over the gardens of St. Mary Mead. She thought of Mrs. Hartley, proud, fearful, undone by secrets not truly her own. She thought of poor Pritchard, silenced because he had seen too much, and she thought of the fragile veil of peace that cloaked the village, so easily torn by the smallest of revelations. At length she sighed, picked up her needles, and resumed her steady rhythm. The world would go on as it always did. Roses would bloom, children would grow, and secrets, there would always be secrets, some harmless, some dangerous, all alike in their power to disturb the calm surface of life. For Miss Marple, it was simply another lesson in human nature, one she had learned many times before and would doubtless learn again. And as the church bell tolled softly in the dusk, she reflected with the faintest smile that even in the quietest of villages, the smallest clues burned manuscripts. A forgotten name could kindle flames that revealed everything.